habitat even more. So these Cape Cod streams are even more susceptible to climate change than the rest of the state, where they can actually move in these large branching stream networks. Here they're like individual straight line streams almost that drop off in salt water. And this is a slide I actually gave to the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. I gave a talk to them about brook trout and climate change, and I thought I'd just kind of bring it in here and expand a little bit on it to tell you why these streams are so important to protect. Next slide. But first I'll talk about some of the other trout streams in the district. I don't know how many of you know about the trout streams that are in Westport, Massachusetts. Westport is a unique little portion of southeastern Mass. It reminds me of New Hampshire. You go there, there's stone walls. It's still pretty much a rural landscape. That's changing these days with development, and the latest thing over there is solar farms. They're basically cutting down forests and putting in solar farms there for renewable energy, which can have some impacts on these little wild trout streams. So these little streams here, they actually drop down in the Westport River estuary, and they become sea-run brown trout. What's amazing about Westport is almost every little stream in Westport has wild brook trout in it. And so it's this unique little area of southeastern Mass that we're trying to protect. And the Coalition for Buzzards Bay has been doing a lot of land protection there. The Division of Fisheries and Wildlife has put in money, as well as the trustees of reservations. So the key to making these streams survive is land protection. These are probably some of the most susceptible to climate change streams that we have here in this area. Next slide. But these fish do drop down into the Westport River estuary. John Kokoska, a Trout Limited member from southeastern Mass, sent me this picture of a trout that he caught down in the Westport River. So the thing about the Westport River streams, they can drop down into that estuary and actually migrate between the streams. It's a very tight little estuary, and the streams are pretty close together. So these fish can actually move and repopulate these streams if they get wiped out from individual streams. Next slide. This one was actually, the Division of Marine Fisheries actually caught this in a fight net that they used to monitor smelt. Smelt are another population of fish that has greatly declined in abundance, and basically they'll probably be wiped out in the Buzzards Bay region within the next 20 years, because the last time I heard they were down to a couple dozen trout in the Weegantic River, which was the last significant smelt population in Buzzards Bay. But they did find this brook trout in their fight net when they were in there trying to catch smelt, and so Brad Chase sent over this photo for me to have. Next slide. We've also helped marine fisheries with an American shad monitoring program up in the South River in Marshfield, and one of the big surprises of helping them out, they were getting my expertise in electrofishing to monitor American shad in this tiny little river called the South River, which feeds into the North River system. And one of the things that we were surprised at is how many brook trout were down in this river in April. And they were coming out of these little tiny tributaries. There's one stream that goes through the Marshfield Fairgrounds, and there's another stream upstream called Furnace Brook. And some of these fish drop down and they inhabit the estuary. The South River in this area where we were catching them is completely tidal. And there was a pretty good abundance of them that one year. This past year there wasn't as many, but we got quite a few brook trout down in there. But once again, these streams are very susceptible to being impacted. There was a subdivision planned right on the shore of this little brook, and luckily the people in the town got concerned, and they were able to put the kibosh on that subdivision plan for at least a little bit. Next slide. Another one up on the south coastal area that's got some little wild brook trout streams, that's got some habitat restoration planned, is the Jones River. This is the Elm Street Dam. Used to be Coughlin, now there's a wedding venue right nearby. There's the water department on one side. It's one of the best smelt runs in the state, but it also has wild brook trout. There's first, second, and third brook of these little tiny tributaries that you can literally step over that have wild brook trout that will migrate down into the Jones River. Up above, there's another tributary called Furnace Brook that has brook trout. And hopefully by removing this head of tide dam, these fish will be able to go down in the salt water like they historically did. I was just at a meeting actually yesterday at the Jones River watershed where we were talking with Brad Chase about smelt spawning and trying to protect the smelt spawning when they were doing this dam removal, and also offer some improved smelt spawning habitat when they remove the dam. But this hopefully will happen within the next couple of years. This is one that I've always hoped would happen. and it's actually moving forward within the next few years. Next slide. Another one, a big restoration project, one of the first big cranberry bog restoration projects was the Eel River up in Plymouth. This was a series of abandoned cranberry bogs just above Russell Mill Pond, above the Eel River, which feeds into Plymouth Harbor by Plymouth Plantation. And this was the first big bog restoration, but they were kind of focused in on white cedar swamp restoration in there. There was a wild brook trout stream. We went out there before the restoration, did the sampling, and we went back afterwards. And unfortunately, they built all this nice habitat. They put in all kinds of logs. They removed a dam. They did a lot of things that were good for brook trout habitat. But the trouble was the upper part, they kind of backed the water up to create these swamp areas for the white cedar. And it warmed the water up. The temperatures in the Eel River were getting up into the low 90s. That's moderated somewhat. I think the temperature I had this past summer was like 88. But the brook trout, the areas where we found brook trout before, we sampled it right after the restoration and we got a single trout. And it was a rainbow trout from the hatchery, Gilbert Trout Hatchery, further downstream in Russell Mill Pond. So that was a little disappointing. The good news here is the trout are hanging on, but like I say, it's about a 100-meter section between the Russell Mill Pond and where there's intense groundwater to keep them alive over the summer. Hopefully, as this grows up, these conditions will moderate and the brook trout habitat will be better in the Eel River. But this was one example of a restoration that wasn't the best thing for brook trout. Next slide. So those concerns were raised by myself to DER and other people, and the next big cranberry bog restoration you might have heard about is Tidmarsh Farms on the Beaver Dam Brook in Plymouth, just south of the Eel River. And one of the things that they were trying to do during the design of this is actually incorporate cold water habitat in the stream channel design. So they went out there with fiber optic sensors. I actually helped Danielle Hare move the cable a couple times, trying to find where this cold water habitat is. And so they specifically try to improve some of the cold water habitat in this area. I'm not sure if this will ever be brook trout habitat, but they have taken some measures to try to improve the cold water.
Isn't it brook trout habitat in the headwaters up high? It looks pretty good.
Well, they removed a dam right up here. This used to be a pond, and so when they dropped that down, there is intense groundwater coming in there. It was still a little bit warm. I actually had a temperature sensor in there, and unfortunately when they removed the dam, they took my sensor out too. So there's extensive monitoring going on right now with MIT. It's called the Living Marsh or something like that. If you look up Tidmarsh, the Living Observatory, you can find all kinds of information that MIT is routinely monitoring and doing all kinds of research on this restoration.
But is it true there are no brook trout there?
No, there's no brook trout. We stock trout further down, but if they ever do get brook trout habitat, this might be a consideration for reintroduction. But right now, there's no brook trout. Next slide. There are brook trout in Plymouth. This was another restoration project up in Plymouth, a very tiny little stream. It used to be the Plymouth Rock Trout Hatchery, the outflow. There were these dams in here that were built by the hatchery manager as a corral for exotic water birds. And they basically kind of dammed up the stream and prevented fish migration. So this was a short little project that was done by the town of Plymouth and the DER. David Gould is one of the town of Plymouth employees that's been very proactive in dam restoration. And he got this project going. They removed the dam. They put in some woody structure. They planted the banks. And next slide. You can see what this looks like today. So it's a big improvement in terms of what this brook actually looks like. There are still brook trout there. We actually did the pre-survey on this, so we did the post-survey, and we got a lot more eels in this section, and just a slight increase in brook trout. Not too many brook trout, but hopefully someday we'll get some more of the sea run brook trout, because now these fish can easily get down into the salt water. But this is a very tiny little